In the heart of Kyoto, hidden among ancient cherry trees and crumbling shrines, there lives a monk who rarely speaks in public, yet whose name is quietly spoken in spiritual circles across Japan. His name is Dion Mickey, and his life defies logic. He lives simply, without television, without modern distractions, and almost without presence in the media. But those who have met him, those who have listened to his words, they speak of something extraordinary. A gift, or perhaps a curse. Mickey is said to possess a rare ability, the power to sense death before it happens, not metaphorically, literally. From the scent of the air to the feeling in his chest, he claims to know when death is near. And what's more disturbing, he's often right. But one incident in particular, more than any other, solidified his reputation. A strange series of encounters with a man who, unknown to Mickey at the time, had already decided to kill him. It began in 1993. Mickey was still a university student, studying Buddhist philosophy at Ryukoku University. He often wandered the streets with a camera in hand, capturing ordinary moments of life, alley cats, blooming trees, the silent rhythm of Kyoto's backstreets. One afternoon, he passed a local pet shop. In the window, a row of fluffy puppies sleeping under warm lamps. He raised his camera, smiled, and took a photo. But before he could take another, the shop owner came out, not angry, just curious. The man invited Mickey inside, saying, "Why don't we have some coffee?" Inside, he laid out 8 cans of coffee on a table. Mickey was invited to pick one. He did. He drank. He left. It felt like nothing, but it happened again. A few weeks later, Mickey returned to decline a job the man had offered. Once more, he was invited in. 8 cans on the table. He picked one. He drank. He left. Years passed. Then in 1996, just before moving to Tokyo, Mickey visited the shop one last time, a farewell gesture. The same routine, 8 cans, one chosen, one consumed, one exit. Shortly after, the entire country was shaken by a news report. The pet shop owner had been arrested. He was not just a merchant, he was a serial killer. And during questioning, he admitted to police that he had once plotted to kill a Buddhist monk just to see if gods would protect him. In all 3 encounters with Mickey, the man confessed 7 out of 8 coffee cans were poisoned. And yet, Mickey had unknowingly chosen the only safe one 3 times in a row. How do you explain that? To Mickey, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a message, a warning, or perhaps a divine shield. And to many in Japan, this was the moment they began to believe that monk Mickey might truly be walking between 2 worlds. Long before the poisoned coffee, long before the headlines, there were signs. Dion Mickey was born in 1972 in Kyoto into a family with deep Buddhist roots. Unlike what many outside Japan may believe, monks there can marry and raise children, and Mickey's early life was shaped by both sacred discipline and gentle warmth. He was an unusually thoughtful child, quiet, observant, sensitive to the moods of people around him. But at the age of 5, something shifted. Something invisible began to call his name. One night, while sleeping soundly, he awoke suddenly, not to a dream, but to a voice. Someone had whispered his name. Then a chill ran down his spine as a cold hand grabbed his ankle and pulled him off the bed. He scrambled up, heart racing, but the room was empty. No open windows, no footsteps, just silence. From that night on, Mickey began to see things others could not. Pale silhouettes at the edge of vision, flickers of faces in the dark, spirits, he believed, of those who had already passed. But seeing wasn't the only thing. Mickey began to smell something strange, an odor that couldn't be described easily. It wasn't rotten. It wasn't incense. It was more like a pressure in the air, like the quiet before a storm. It was the scent of death. The first time it happened, Mickey was eating dinner with his family. He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. Something was wrong. The scent, it was coming from his father. Though just a boy, Mickey looked up and asked with unusual calm, "Dad, would you like to get a checkup tomorrow?" His mother scolded him. don't say such unlucky things." But within days, his father was diagnosed with stomach cancer. Doctors gave him 6 months. With devoted care, he lived another 2 years. Mickey never forgot that moment. It was the first time he understood that his intuition wasn't just imagination. It was a gift and a burden, one that allowed him to warn those he loved, one that whispered of a world beyond the visible. From then on, he trained himself to notice more, not just the scent, but the silences in conversation, the pauses in breath, the invisible weight in a room. While most children played, Mickey listened. Years later, this sensitivity would echo in a story from another continent, one involving not a monk, but a cat. At a nursing home in the United States, there lived a feline named Oscar. He was quiet, kept to himself, and often avoided human touch. But the staff began to notice something chilling. Whenever Oscar entered a room and curled up next to a patient, that patient would pass away within hours. Oscar had no medical training, but over time, nurses recorded that he had accurately predicted at least 25 deaths. This strange tale deeply resonated with Mickey. To him, it was proof that the scent of death is real, even if most of the world cannot perceive it. And sometimes, what we sense isn't even among the living. One afternoon, while browsing in an old Kyoto bookstore, Mickey froze. The scent was back, strong, near. He looked around and saw an elderly man browsing calmly near a bookshelf. Unsure what to do, Mickey hesitated. What could he say? "Excuse me, sir, I think you're about to die." Before he could decide, the man turned to him and asked, "What are you looking at, young man?" Mickey paused, then answered softly, "Your face looks a little tired. Maybe you should see a doctor." The old man smiled. "Thank you for your concern, but I don't need to go anymore." And just like that, he vanished. Not into another room, he disappeared. Stunned, Mickey stood frozen, realizing what he had just encountered, not a man, but a spirit. One whose lingering energy could still be sensed through the scent of death. From a Buddhist perspective, when someone dies, their soul does not immediately leave this world. Instead, it lingers for 49 days, a transitional stage before reincarnation. And during that time, some spirits remain, especially in places they once loved. Mickey believed that those with heightened sensitivity, like himself, and perhaps even Oscar the cat, can sense this passage. But even more than sensing spirits, Mickey began to sense something else, a deeper truth. That life does not end with death. It only changes form. And soon, he would encounter something that would prove this to him in a way he would never forget. It was during a spiritual exchange trip to India that Dion Mickey would encounter something that would change his understanding of life and death forever. He had traveled to the city of Rajgir, one of Buddhism's 8 sacred sites, known for its ancient monasteries and legends of the Buddha's teachings echoing through stone and wind. But what awaited him there wasn't a scripture or a relic, it was a living creature. At a rural cattle farm outside the city, Mickey met an Indian man who, to his surprise, spoke fluent Japanese. The man had studied in Japan as a youth and now managed the family farm. As they spoke, the farmer shared a strange story about one particular cow. He said the animal behaved oddly aloof to most people, yet strangely emotional when he spoke Japanese. At times, the cow would walk up to him, look into his eyes, and even shed tears. Intrigued, Mickey agreed to visit the farm. As they approached the pasture, the farmer raised his voice and called out in Japanese, "A Japanese person has come to visit." From across the field, one cow raised its head and began walking directly toward them. Mickey stood silently. The animal stopped in front of him. Their eyes met. Gently, the monk asked, in Japanese, "Were you Japanese in the past life?" And what happened next defied all reason. The cow let out a soft cry, then slowly, unmistakably nodded. Tears welled up in its large eyes. Its body trembled. It let out another cry, not of pain, but of sorrow. And in that moment, Mickey felt something pass between them, a recognition, a remembering. He knelt down, pressed his hands together, and softly asked, "Do you still remember your past life?" Again, the cow nodded. Again, it wept. Mickey could feel it now, a presence trapped within the body of an animal, a soul still holding onto echoes of its human experience. There were no words, no explanations, but in the monk's heart something shifted. This was not just belief anymore. This was contact. This was proof. He began to chant the Lotus Sutra, a sacred Buddhist scripture believed to bring peace to restless spirits and dissolve karmic burdens. He hoped to help the cow find resolution, to ease whatever sorrow it still carried. Before leaving, Mickey gently placed his hand on the cow's head and promised, "I'll return tomorrow." That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, playing the moment over and over again in his mind. For years, he had believed in reincarnation because of what the sutras said, but now he had looked into the eyes of a soul reborn. The next morning, a call came from the farmer. The cow was weak, very weak. Mickey rushed back to the farm. There, lying in the grass, was the same cow. Its breath was shallow. Its body was completely motionless, except for one final flicker of life. Mickey knelt beside it. Softly, he whispered, "Are you okay?" The cow stirred. It opened its eyes, and in one final act, it gave a small nod. Then, with a quiet exhale, it passed away. No one could say for sure who that cow had once been. No name, no origin, just emotion, recognition, and tears. But Mickey didn't need documentation. He had felt it. He had witnessed it. And in his heart, he knew this soul had been reborn, and now it was ready to move on. What shaped that rebirth? According to Buddhist thought, it was karma, the accumulation of one's actions, thoughts, and intentions in life. And when death comes, it is karma that decides the next chapter. Not randomly, but with precision beyond our comprehension. To Mickey, this encounter was no accident. It was another message, that the boundaries between species, between lives, between worlds, are not as fixed as we believe. And as he walked away from the pasture that morning, one thought echoed in his mind. What other souls around us are silently waiting to be seen again? In 2005, after years of monastic training, monk Dion Mickey was appointed as the 38th abbot of an old temple in Kyoto. While the title sounded prestigious, the reality was sobering. The temple had fallen into decay, its tiled roof leaking, its wooden statues cracked and missing limbs, and its once lively halls now silent. Mickey knew this was no ordinary mission. This was restoration, not just of wood and stone, but of sacred energy. But without funds, devotion alone could only go so far. One night, after working into the evening, he dozed off in a room behind the altar. In his sleep, he had a vivid dream. The god Daikoku, one of Japan's 7 lucky gods, appeared, but not as he is usually depicted. Instead of golden robes and cheerful roundness, Daikoku wore ragged clothes and looked worn. He walked toward the exit of the temple. Just before vanishing, he looked back and said, "Farewell." Something then slipped from his sack. When Mickey called out to return it, the god simply smiled and said, "That's my gift to you." Mickey awoke, not lying down, but kneeling before the Buddha statue. The next morning, guided by instinct, he inspected the temple. In a dark corner of the main hall, he found a forgotten statue. It was Daikoku, and the bag carved in his hand was torn in the same place as in the dream. To some, this might seem like coincidence, but to Mickey, this was synchronicity, the universe speaking not with words but with symbols. Weeks later, a single mother came to the temple with her son. She had little money, but insisted on donating her savings to support the temple's restoration. Mickey gently declined, but the woman persisted. Touched by her sincerity, he accepted, and half-jokingly told her to try her luck with a lottery ticket on her way home. Days later, she returned weeping. She had followed his suggestion. She bought a ticket, and she won back the exact amount she had donated. But what she said next chilled Mickey. I was planning to end my life and my son's. That donation was a farewell. The chain of events didn't stop there. She later won a large prize at a horse racing booth, something she never would have approached in the past. With the winnings, she opened a shop, rebuilt her life, and came back to the temple not for blessings, but to give thanks. And what followed was even stranger. A shop owner nearby delivered an unused pedestal, originally crafted for another Buddha statue. It had been rejected for being the wrong size, but when placed under the Daikokyutin statue in Mickey's temple, it fit perfectly, with no adjustment needed. Some might call it luck, others might say fate, but Mickey saw something deeper. When a heart gives sincerely, the world begins to rearrange itself around that kindness. That wasn't religion, that was resonance. Just when Mickey thought the miracles had reached their peak, something else happened, something that felt less like a coincidence and more like a quiet orchestration. During the dismantling of an old building not far from the temple, a team of construction workers uncovered a set of ancient stone statues buried under layers of earth and debris. They weren't archaeologists, but even they could tell these figures weren't ordinary. Someone recognized the iconography and whispered a name, the 7 Lucky Gods. Unsure of what to do, the workers brought the statues to Mickey's temple. Perhaps they had heard the stories, the strange dream, the lottery miracle, the fitting pedestal. Or perhaps they simply followed instinct, as people often do when something feels sacred without reason. When Mickey saw the statues, he didn't speak for a long time. He examined each one carefully, weathered but intact. Though covered in dust and cracks, their faces retained serenity, their postures dignity. He arranged them gently in the main hall, creating a circle of presence around the Daikokyutin statue that had first appeared to him in the dream. It was then that the realization came. Perhaps Daikokyutin did not return alone. Perhaps he brought the others back with him. In Japanese folklore, the 7 lucky gods represent different forms of fortune: wisdom, health, joy, protection, art, abundance, longevity. For them to reappear together, without warning, without plan, felt like more than cultural symbolism. To Mickey, it hinted at a pattern forming in silence, as if the divine, in its quietest voice, had chosen a place to gather again. Not with thunder, not with spectacle, but through subtle placement, dream, chance, delivery, visitors began arriving more frequently. Some brought offerings, others just wanted to sit, to feel. They couldn't explain what drew them there. But many said the temple felt different, lighter, older yet more alive. Was it the statues or the stories that clung to them? Mickey never made claims. He never said this is a miracle. But in his private reflections, he wrote of the re-emergence of sacred presence, not as proof of the gods, but as a reflection of human readiness. He believed that sacred symbols return not when we summon them, but when we begin to remember what they stood for. Perhaps the gods don't arrive with trumpets. Perhaps they wait, and when the world grows too forgetful, they simply make themselves visible again. To those who watched from the outside, the sequence of events was too precise to ignore. A dream. A hidden statue, a miracle donation, a matching pedestal, and now the full pantheon returning to one forgotten temple. One could argue it was luck, but Mickey believed otherwise. He believed this was a spiritual convergence, a moment in which things long separated begin to realign. And perhaps he thought these signs were not only for him, but for the world. Because since 2010, Mickey had carried a quiet burden, a message he didn't want to give, but knew he must. A vision of a future that could still be altered, a year that would change everything. That year was 2025. In 2010, during a relatively unknown lecture, monk Dion Mickey presented a sequence of predictions concerning the future of humanity. These were not framed as a single catastrophic event, but as a structured series of 7 large-scale crises. Each one, he claimed, would emerge in succession, affecting a different aspect of global civilization. The first prediction described a global pandemic, an infectious disease that would spread across national borders and severely disrupt economic and social systems. Over a decade later, the COVID-19 pandemic occurred, resulting in millions of deaths and temporary collapses of healthcare infrastructure in many countries. The scale and impact of the outbreak drew renewed attention to Mickey's earlier statement. The second prediction involved the escalation of warfare between sovereign nations. Mickey referred to conflicts initiated through deliberate acts of aggression. The war between Russia and Ukraine, as well as ongoing military tensions between India and Pakistan, are commonly cited when reviewing this stage of the sequence. The third prediction focused on internal societal collapse, marked by political violence, ideological polarization, and a breakdown in public trust. Notable events such as the assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the 2024 assassination attempt on former U.S. President Donald Trump are often referenced as corresponding examples. The fourth calamity concerned astronomical phenomena. Mickey mentioned the rare alignment of 6 or 7 planets, a configuration that, in ancient traditions, was believed to foreshadow major changes in the human world. In February 2025, astronomers confirmed the occurrence of such an alignment, visible in parts of the world. The fifth prediction dealt with solar and lunar eclipses, which Mickey suggested would signal energetic or environmental imbalances rather than being purely astronomical events. While this claim is not supported by mainstream science, some individuals report a heightened psychological or spiritual sensitivity during such occurrences. The sixth stage involved abrupt and unseasonal weather patterns, snowfall in summer, hailstorms in unexpected regions, and anomalous lightning activity. In recent years, numerous incidents of extreme weather have been recorded globally, including snow in desert areas and destructive hail in agricultural zones. The final prediction warned of prolonged drought leading to food insecurity. Mickey suggested that unsustainable resource use would damage water systems and agricultural productivity, increasing the risk of famine. Contemporary concerns over drought in regions of Asia and Africa, along with disrupted crop yields, reflect aspects of this warning. What makes the sequence particularly notable is not only the nature of each event, but the apparent order in which they have unfolded. Observers who track Mickey's predictions point out that real-world events seem to be occurring in alignment with the timeline he proposed more than a decade ago. However, Mickey did not frame his predictions as unavoidable destiny. He consistently emphasized that the future is subject to human decision-making. He believed these crises could serve as warning signs, indicators of systemic issues in the relationship between humanity and its environment. He identified the root causes not as external forces, but as human behaviors, disconnection from nature, ideological division, ecological exploitation, and fear-based social structures. According to Mickey, if humanity continues along the current path, the full sequence of calamities may complete itself. But if individuals and societies begin to adjust course through cooperation, compassion, and sustainable action, the timeline can be interrupted or reversed. In his view, 2025 was not the endpoint, but a point of divergence. The future, he said, is not a fixed outcome, but a collective direction still open to change. Don't just watch the mystery, be part of it. Subscribe to 100K, Wise for stories that question everything we thought we knew.